7 minutes before midnight, Ethan Brooks saw the woman he had spent 20 years trying not to remember standing beneath a street lamp across from the ballroom where his company was celebrating its most profitable year. Jasmine Reed wore the blue scarf he had knitted for her when they were both broke, hopeful, and foolish enough to believe love could survive any amount of ambition. She was not looking at the fireworks preparations, the television cameras, or the famous guests entering beneath the golden awning. She was staring directly at a banner announcing Brooks Capital's newest redevelopment initiative in Harlem. Ethan crossed the ballroom without answering the mayor, ignored his assistant calling after him, and pushed through the revolving doors into the snow just as Jasmine turned toward the street. Their eyes met across Fifth Avenue, and the expression on her face was not surprise, affection, or anger, but something far more unsettling, recognition mixed with warning. A city bus passed between them, and when Ethan reached the opposite sidewalk, Jasmine had vanished, leaving behind only a folded city planning notice trapped against the curb by melting snow. He picked up the notice and recognized the name of his company before he understood anything else written beneath it. Brooks Capital Holdings had filed an application to acquire 11 residential buildings, 2 nonprofit facilities, and the East Harlem Community Resource Center, the same building where Ethan and Jasmine had first met as volunteers 20 years earlier. According to the notice, demolition could begin within 60 days after the final municipal review. Yet Ethan had never seen the proposal, despite serving as founder, chief executive officer, and controlling shareholder. At the bottom of the page, someone had underlined a sentence in blue ink, stating that objections submitted after January 3rd would not be considered. Beside that line, in handwriting Ethan recognized immediately, Jasmine had written 6 words: "You promised this would never happen." Fireworks exploded above Manhattan, while strangers embraced around him, but Ethan remained motionless beneath the street lamp, holding proof that Jasmine had not returned to New York by accident. He entered the apartment building behind him and asked the night doorman whether the exterior camera had recorded the sidewalk, although his voice sounded less controlled than he intended. The doorman recognized Ethan, but refused to release footage without written authorization, explaining that privacy rules remained in effect, even for billionaires on New Year's Eve. Ethan accepted the refusal, requested the property manager's contact information, and stepped back outside without offering money, threats, or the kind of influence his executives usually expected him to use. For the first time in years, he understood that urgency could not excuse entitlement, especially when the woman he sought had spent her life protecting people from powerful men who considered rules inconvenient. He called his chief operating officer, Daniel Mercer, and asked why the Harlem acquisition had advanced without his review. Daniel hesitated before saying the project had been handled directly by board chairman Michael Davenport, because Ethan had previously authorized an accelerated approval process for strategic investments. "I authorize speed," Ethan replied, watching snow gather along the edge of Jasmine's handwritten warning. "Not secrecy." Daniel promised to send the complete transaction file before morning, but Ethan heard strain beneath his professional tone. When Ethan asked whether Jasmine Reed's name appeared anywhere in the documents, Daniel became silent long enough to answer the question without words. Finally, he admitted that Reed Community Design had submitted multiple objections, including claims that the relocation studies underestimated displacement and omitted several protected tenants. Michael's legal team had categorized the objections as advocacy material rather than independent analysis, and the board had continued reviewing the acquisition as though no substantial challenge existed. Ethan asked why he had not been informed, and Daniel said Michael believed personal history might compromise Ethan's judgment. The statement struck harder than the cold, because it confirmed that someone inside Brooks Capital knew exactly who Jasmine was and had intentionally kept her away from him. Ethan returned to the Grand Regent only long enough to collect his coat, laptop, and the leather briefcase his assistant had placed beside the stage. The countdown had ended. Champagne covered the floor near the orchestra, and guests congratulated him as though entering a new year automatically erased everything unfinished in the old one. His assistant, Claire Lawson, studied the planning notice in his hand and quietly asked whether something had happened. Ethan told her to cancel his morning interviews, obtain every public filing connected to the Harlem redevelopment, and contact the apartment property manager as soon as the office opened. Claire had worked for him long enough to recognize when a business problem had become personal, yet she asked no unnecessary questions. Before leaving, she handed him a small envelope delivered to the ballroom reception earlier that evening by an unidentified woman wearing a cream-colored coat. Inside the envelope was a photocopy of a notebook page Ethan had written when he was 23, before Brooks Capital existed anywhere except his imagination. His younger handwriting filled the page with rough calculations about neighborhood investment, affordable lending, and local ownership, while one sentence had been circled repeatedly in blue ink. Success should leave a community stronger than it found it. Beneath the copy, Jasmine had written a date, an address in Harlem, and a final message that made Ethan forget the noise of the ballroom entirely. Come tomorrow at noon if you still believe this. Come alone, and do not tell Michael Davenport where you are going. Ethan read the warning twice, realizing Jasmine was not merely asking him to stop a development project. She believed the man who had financed Ethan's first opportunity 20 years earlier was still controlling decisions inside the company Ethan thought he owned. He left the hotel through a private entrance and walked several blocks before allowing his driver to find him, because movement felt easier than admitting how thoroughly he had ignored the life growing beneath his success. Michael Davenport had been the first investor willing to fund Ethan's proposal when 37 others had refused, and Ethan had trusted him through every crisis, acquisition, and expansion that followed. Michael had taught him how to negotiate, how to survive hostile markets, and how to build a company large enough to influence entire cities. Jasmine had once warned that gratitude could become dangerous when it prevented a person from asking what someone expected in return. But Ethan had dismissed the concern as caution from someone unfamiliar with the pressure of business. Now, with her message folded inside his coat and a secret acquisition threatening the neighborhood where their dreams had begun, Ethan wondered whether the greatest mistake of his life had not been losing Jasmine, but allowing the same man to take both her and his original purpose from him without ever realizing a theft had occurred. At noon the following day, Ethan entered the East Harlem Community Resource Center through a side door that still carried scratches from decades of winter coats, basketball equipment, and children rushing toward after-school programs. The building smelled of coffee, tempera paint, old radiators, and the lemon cleaner volunteers had used for as long as he could remember. Yet the familiarity did not comfort him, because every room now appeared on Brooks Capital's demolition map. Jasmine waited inside the former tutoring room, wearing the same cream coat but without the blue scarf, while architectural drawings and legal documents covered the tables where Ethan once taught teenagers how compound interest worked. She did not embrace him, accuse him, or ask whether he had missed her. She simply placed his company's acquisition file between them and asked whether he had approved it. Ethan answered honestly that he had approved an accelerated process, but had never seen the properties involved, a distinction that sounded increasingly weak as he heard himself make it. "You built a system where not knowing became convenient," Jasmine said, her voice calm enough to prevent him from defending himself too quickly. "That does not make you innocent, Ethan. It only means you stopped paying attention before the damage reached your desk." He accepted the judgment because she was right, although the truth did not erase his need to understand why she had warned him specifically about Michael. Jasmine opened a weathered blue notebook and removed copies of correspondence dating back 20 years, including a redevelopment proposal prepared shortly after Ethan received his first investment. The project involved several Brooklyn apartment buildings owned by families with limited access to legal representation, and Michael's original fund had planned to purchase the debt, force rapid foreclosures, and resell the land to a luxury developer. Jasmine had discovered the strategy while assisting a tenant organization and had sent Ethan a detailed letter explaining that the investor supporting his company was using Ethan's social mission as public cover. She had expected him to challenge Michael, protect the residents, or at least ask questions before signing additional agreements. Instead, Ethan never answered, and within weeks, Brooks Capital announced its first major partnership with Davenport Urban Assets. Ethan felt the room shift beneath him, although he knew the floor had not moved. He told Jasmine that her letter had arrived damaged and empty, accompanied by a postal notice saying the contents had been destroyed during processing. Jasmine studied him for several seconds before reaching into the notebook and placing a receipt on the table. The original envelope had not been mailed through the postal service. She had delivered it personally to Brooks Capital's first office, where Michael's assistant signed for it at 7:23, the morning after Ethan missed the community center anniversary. Jasmine had kept the receipt because the allegations involved tenants facing eviction, and she knew documentation mattered more than trust when powerful institutions were involved. Ethan stared at the signature, recognizing the name of a woman who later became Michael's private legal counsel. The empty envelope was not an accident, Ethan said, feeling 20 years of assumptions collapse into a colder, more deliberate explanation. "I never knew what you received," Jasmine answered. "I only knew you signed the partnership, stopped returning calls, and allowed the buildings to be sold 3 months later." Ethan remembered that period as a blur of investor meetings, emergency loans, and fear that his company would fail before it began. Yet memory could not absolve him of choices he had made willingly. Michael had presented the partnership as a rescue package requiring immediate signatures, and Ethan had accepted because payroll was due, his first employees depended on him, and failure felt more terrifying than questions he did not understand. The Brooklyn properties had been described as distressed assets with voluntary relocation agreements, language Ethan had repeated without visiting the neighborhood. He had told himself that experienced attorneys had examined everything, while Jasmine was apparently waiting for him to recognize that real families lived behind those neutral phrases. His company survived. Hundreds of employees later built stable careers, and Ethan became celebrated for overcoming impossible odds. But the foundation of that success now carried consequences he had never allowed himself to investigate. Jasmine explained that she had left New York after spending a year helping displaced families challenge agreements that courts ultimately upheld. She did not leave because Ethan missed one celebration, nor because his ambition made her lonely, although both wounds had mattered. She left because remaining close to him required pretending his success had not been purchased, partly through silence, and she could not build a life beside a man whose company threatened the people she had promised to serve. Over the following years, she worked in Chicago, Baltimore, and Detroit, developing community ownership models that protected residents during redevelopment. 4 years earlier, she returned to New York after winning a foundation grant to restore the Harlem neighborhood, never expecting Brooks Capital to target the same blocks. When she learned Michael Davenport chaired the acquisition committee and had excluded Ethan from direct review, she understood the pattern was repeating with greater sophistication. Ethan asked why she had not contacted him earlier, and Jasmine's expression revealed exhaustion rather than resentment. She had submitted reports, attended hearings, contacted company counsel, and written directly to Ethan's corporate office 3 times, yet every communication was redirected to Michael's legal division. Her final attempt had been the envelope delivered to the ballroom because public access made interception more difficult. She had stood outside debating whether to approach Ethan when she saw him beneath the hotel lights, surrounded by cameras and people praising the expansion that would destroy her work. Before she could decide, he stepped outside and recognized her, forcing 20 years into a moment neither had prepared to face. She left because meeting him privately carried fewer risks than confronting him before Michael's allies. A door opened near the hallway, and Daniel Mercer entered, despite Jasmine's instruction that Ethan come alone. Ethan immediately demanded an explanation, but Daniel locked the door behind him and placed a flash drive beside the acquisition file. He had followed Ethan because Michael's attorneys were monitoring executive schedules and had already asked why the chief executive officer canceled his morning appearances. Daniel had spent the night reviewing internal archives, where he discovered altered impact reports, hidden tenant protections, and emails instructing analysts to exclude Jasmine's research from the board package. More troubling was a memorandum authorizing the sale of the community center's land before municipal approval had been granted, suggesting Michael had promised the property to another investor months earlier. Ethan asked whether the board knew, and Daniel answered that several directors knew enough to avoid asking questions. Jasmine inserted the flash drive into an aging computer and the screen displayed a confidential agreement between Davenport Urban Assets and a private development consortium. The consortium would pay Michael a substantial advisory fee if Brooks Capital delivered all 11 blocks vacant and construction ready by summer, while penalties would apply if protected tenants delayed demolition. Ethan's name appeared on the signature page through an electronic authorization attached to the accelerated approval policy he had signed the previous spring. Legally, the transaction carried his authority, even though he had never reviewed its terms. Michael had not forged Ethan's signature. He had designed a system where Ethan's trust performed the same function. Before anyone could speak, Claire called Ethan and said Michael had scheduled an emergency board meeting for 3 o'clock. The official agenda concerned leadership stability and concerns that Ethan's personal relationship with an activist had compromised the Harlem acquisition. News outlets were already receiving anonymous tips describing Jasmine as a former romantic partner attempting to manipulate Brooks Capital for personal gain. Ethan looked at her as the first online headline appeared, using a photograph taken through the community center window less than an hour earlier. Michael was not preparing to defend the project. He was preparing to discredit Jasmine, remove Ethan, and complete the deal before either of them could prove what had happened. Ethan reached Brooks Capital headquarters at 2:42, walking through a lobby where financial reporters had gathered beneath screens, displaying photographs of him and Jasmine outside the community center. The headlines framed their reunion as a billionaire's emotional crisis, reducing years of public interest work to speculation about an old romance and ignoring every documented objection to the Harlem acquisition. Claire guided him through a private elevator while explaining that Michael's communications team had distributed background material portraying Jasmine as financially dependent on nonprofit grants threatened by redevelopment. None of the claims were entirely false, which made them more effective. Reed Community Design relied on grants, and its largest project would disappear if demolition continued. The manipulation came from omitting that Jasmine had rejected 2 lucrative consulting offers from Brooks Capital's competitors and had disclosed every funding source during municipal hearings. Michael had built a narrative strong enough to survive until the real evidence arrived too late. Inside the boardroom, Michael Davenport sat at the head of the table Ethan normally occupied, surrounded by directors, attorneys, and advisors who avoided meeting Ethan's eyes. At 68, Michael remained physically composed and impeccably dressed, with the patient expression of a man who considered anger an inefficient form of power. He welcomed Ethan as though no betrayal had occurred, then explained that the board had a fiduciary duty to address concerns about judgment, disclosure, and executive stability. Ethan placed the planning notice, Jasmine's delivery receipt, and Daniel's flash drive on the table, before saying the only instability inside Brooks Capital came from leaders who mistook secrecy for discipline. Michael did not look at the documents because he already knew what they contained. Instead, he asked whether Ethan intended to destroy billions in shareholder value because a former girlfriend had revived an old grievance. "She is not the issue," Ethan replied. "The issue is that you concealed material objections, manipulated impact studies, and used my authorization to enter a side agreement benefiting your private firm." Michael's attorney immediately warned that the accusation was defamatory, but Ethan asked Daniel to distribute copies of the agreement and supporting emails. Daniel hesitated near the door, his face pale, then admitted the archive had been remotely restricted shortly after they left Harlem. The files on his flash drive remained intact, but metadata linking them to company servers had disappeared, allowing Michael's counsel to argue they might have been altered. Michael leaned back with quiet satisfaction and explained that digital documents without verified custody would not justify suspending a project approved by committees, outside counsel, and city agencies. Several directors appeared disturbed, yet none wanted to jeopardize themselves without evidence strong enough to withstand litigation. Ethan understood that moral certainty and legal proof were not the same thing, a distinction Jasmine had learned long before he did. Michael proposed a temporary leave of absence while an independent committee reviewed Ethan's conduct, presenting the motion as protection for the company rather than an attempt to remove its founder. If approved, Michael would assume executive authority and signed the final municipal redevelopment agreement on Friday. Ethan could challenge the decision, but any public dispute would trigger lending covenants and place thousands of employees at risk. The trap was designed around Ethan's greatest vulnerability. He would sacrifice himself before allowing the company to collapse, just as he had accepted Michael's first rescue package 20 years earlier. Michael had spent decades learning which fears controlled him, then built every agreement so resistance looked irresponsible. Ethan requested 24 hours before the vote, claiming he needed time to consult personal counsel and review the allegations. Michael granted 6 hours, confident that no evidence strong enough to change the board could be found by evening. Ethan returned to his office, where the skyline looked exactly as it had on countless successful afternoons. Yet every building now reminded him how easily distance converted people into abstractions. Jasmine called once but ended the call after he told her reporters had surrounded the community center and children were being escorted through a rear exit. She was not frightened for herself. She was furious that families already facing displacement had become scenery in a corporate campaign. Ethan apologized, although apology without action sounded like another version of the man she had left. Jasmine told him that if protecting the neighborhood required destroying her reputation, she would endure it, but she would not allow him to rescue her by making another impulsive promise he could not sustain. Whatever he chose had to survive after guilt faded and public attention moved elsewhere. Claire searched historical corporate records while Daniel contacted a cybersecurity firm capable of recovering server logs through independent backup systems. Ethan reviewed the original Brooklyn transaction, reading tenant affidavits he should have examined 20 years earlier. Among the files was the name of a legal aid attorney, Rachel Moreno, who had represented several displaced families, and later filed a professional complaint, alleging that Davenport Urban Assets concealed conflicts of interest. The complaint had been dismissed after the supporting witness withdrew, but the witness name stopped Ethan's breathing for a moment. Eleanor Shaw, Michael's former assistant, was the same woman who had signed for Jasmine's letter. Public records showed Eleanor retired 12 years earlier and lived in New Jersey, yet Claire discovered that she had recently contacted Brooks Capital's ethics hotline regarding the Harlem acquisition. The complaint had been closed as unsubstantiated without reaching Ethan or the audit committee. Ethan called the number listed in her retired employee file, expecting silence, but an older woman answered after several rings. When he identified himself, Eleanor asked whether Jasmine Reed had finally found him. Ethan said she had, then asked what happened to the letter delivered 20 years earlier. Eleanor remained silent long enough for Ethan to hear a clock ticking in the background. She explained that Michael opened the envelope after recognizing Jasmine's name, removed the documents, and instructed Eleanor to create a postal damage notice using stationery from another company in the building. At the time, Eleanor believed she was protecting a fragile investment from an emotional distraction. But years later, she discovered the tenant displacement reports Jasmine had described were accurate. She had kept copies of Michael's handwritten instructions, the original letter, and several internal memoranda, because shame did not erase fear, and she never found the courage to release them. When Harlem appeared in the news, she contacted the ethics hotline, only to receive a closure notice signed by Michael's private counsel. Ethan asked whether she would testify before the board, but Eleanor refused because Michael had already threatened to pursue claims involving confidentiality agreements and pension benefits. He did not pressure her, recognizing how often powerful men described fear as weakness after creating the conditions that produced it. Instead, he asked whether she would allow an independent attorney to authenticate the documents without revealing her identity immediately. Eleanor agreed on one condition: Ethan had to read Jasmine's original letter before deciding what to do. She sent scanned copies through a secure legal portal, and the first page appeared on Ethan's screen minutes later. Jasmine had not written a farewell letter. She had written a warning, followed by a plan showing how Ethan could protect the tenants, preserve his company, and restructure Michael's investment without violating their agreements. The final paragraph said she knew he was frightened, exhausted, and carrying responsibility for employees who trusted him, but courage did not mean having no risk. It meant refusing to make strangers pay for the risk he feared taking himself. She ended by asking him to meet her at the East River bench the following evening, where they could decide together what kind of future they were willing to build. Ethan had spent 20 years believing he missed a goodbye, when in reality, he had missed an invitation to become the man Jasmine already believed he could be. Ethan read Jasmine's letter twice before calling her, although he knew no explanation could return the years taken by deception and his own failure to question convenient circumstances. She answered from a borrowed office above the community center, where attorneys and neighborhood organizers were preparing an emergency injunction against demolition. Ethan told her the original letter had survived, described Eleanor's confession, and admitted that Jasmine had offered him a solution he was never allowed to see. For the first time since their reunion, her composure broke, not into anger, but into silence so complete he could hear her struggling to breathe. She had built an entire adult life around the belief that Ethan read her warning and chose Michael anyway. Learning that the choice had been hidden from him did not erase his later neglect, but it altered the wound she had carried for 2 decades. "I hated myself for hoping there was another explanation," she finally said. After enough years, hope started feeling like a refusal to respect what happened. Ethan wanted to tell her everything could now be repaired, yet he understood that such certainty would insult them both. He said the truth gave them responsibility, not permission to pretend the lost years had not existed. Jasmine agreed to let Eleanor's documents support the injunction, provided the residents' case remained central and their history did not become another headline distracting from the neighborhood. Ethan promised nothing he could not guarantee, then asked her to meet him at City Hall before the final planning review. The board vote would occur that evening, but the municipal process offered a second battlefield Michael did not fully control. If they proved material information had been withheld from public agencies, the city could suspend approval regardless of who led Brooks Capital. Claire arranged for Eleanor's documents to be authenticated by an independent forensic examiner and delivered under attorney privilege to both the audit committee and city inspector general. Daniel's cybersecurity team recovered mirrored server logs showing that Michael's office had deleted impact studies, altered classification labels, and restricted Ethan's access after the New Year's Eve encounter. The evidence strengthened their case, yet one problem remained. Michael's side agreement did not explicitly require illegal displacement, only delivery of vacant property under applicable law. His attorneys could argue the company intended to negotiate lawful buyouts, preserve protected tenants, and adjust plans if necessary. To prove misconduct, Ethan needed evidence that Michael knew the relocation assumptions were false before approving the transaction. Jasmine remembered a meeting 6 months earlier when a Brooks Capital analyst privately warned her that internal models predicted displacement nearly 4 times higher than the public report. The analyst refused to provide documents, fearing termination and immigration complications connected to her work visa. Jasmine had recorded no conversation because she wanted to preserve trust, but she remembered the woman's first name, Priya, and the department where she worked. Claire identified Priya Nair, a senior housing analyst placed on administrative leave 3 weeks earlier for alleged performance issues. Her access badge had been disabled, her corporate email deleted, and a severance agreement offered on the condition that she waive all claims and maintain confidentiality. Ethan located Priya through an emergency contact file and met her in a quiet attorney's office near Union Square. She arrived carrying nothing, sat near the door, and explained that Michael's team ordered analysts to calculate displacement using census data more than a decade old. When Priya updated the model with current tenant records, the projected number of displaced residents increased from 480 to nearly 2,000. She also discovered that several buildings contained rent-stabilized units and elderly tenants entitled to legal protections extending the timeline beyond Michael's contractual deadline. After she refused to sign the revised public report, her supervisor removed her name, changed the assumptions, and placed her on leave. Priya had preserved one printed draft with handwritten notes, but it remained locked inside her desk at Brooks Capital. Retrieving the report without authorization would expose Priya to accusations of theft, while ordering company security to release it could alert Michael before the board vote. Ethan chose a slower, lawful path and directed outside counsel to issue a preservation demand, covering every physical and electronic document associated with the acquisition. Once the demand reached corporate counsel, destroying or concealing Priya's report would create clear legal consequences. Michael responded within minutes by accusing Ethan of sabotaging the company and advancing the board meeting to 5 o'clock. He also instructed security to prevent Ethan, Claire, and Daniel from entering executive areas without board authorization. Ethan entered the boardroom through the public reception floor with his personal attorneys, carrying authenticated copies of Eleanor's confession and the recovered server logs. Jasmine did not attend because he refused to let Michael place her on trial before directors whose decisions concerned their own exposure. Michael opened the meeting by warning that lenders were prepared to freeze credit lines if leadership uncertainty continued. Ethan responded that the greater financial danger came from completing an acquisition built on concealed data, undisclosed conflicts, and false public submissions. He distributed the evidence, then disclosed that he had notified the city inspector general, the audit committee's outside counsel, and the company's insurance carriers. Several directors reacted with anger, not because they doubted him, but because his actions removed their ability to contain the scandal privately. Michael remained calm until Ethan mentioned Eleanor Shaw. For the first time, his expression tightened, revealing that memory could frighten him more than accusation. He admitted intercepting Jasmine's letter, but claimed he acted to prevent an inexperienced founder from abandoning employees during a temporary emotional crisis. According to Michael, Ethan became successful precisely because someone had protected him from idealistic decisions he lacked the courage to make. The argument carried enough truth to wound. Ethan had benefited from Michael's ruthless judgment, and thousands of people now depended on the company it helped create. However, Ethan finally understood that gratitude did not require surrendering moral authority forever. "You did not protect me from failure," Ethan said. "You protected your investment from the person I might have become if I had known the truth." Before the directors could vote, outside counsel entered carrying Priya's printed displacement model, recovered from her sealed office under the preservation demand. Her supervisor's handwritten instruction appeared across the final page: reduce protected tenant count, remove delay scenario, and use chairman-approved assumptions. Attached emails showed Michael personally approving the changes after receiving warnings that the public report would mislead city reviewers. The room shifted from uncertainty to self-preservation as directors began consulting attorneys and distancing themselves from the acquisition. Michael attempted to adjourn the meeting, but the independent directors voted to suspend him pending investigation and delay all Harlem transactions. Ethan expected relief, yet Michael delivered one final warning before leaving. Suspending the acquisition triggered a penalty exceeding $200 million, and several lenders could demand immediate repayment if Brooks Capital acknowledged material misconduct. Saving the neighborhood might now destabilize the company, eliminate thousands of jobs, and destroy retirement funds belonging to employees who had never participated in the deception. Ethan had exposed the truth, but truth had not simplified the choice. It had merely ensured that every consequence would now belong to him. By morning, Brooks Capital's stock had fallen 18%. Financial networks were questioning the company's future, and employees crowded internal forums asking whether layoffs were imminent. Michael's suspension became public before Ethan could address the workforce, while anonymous sources described the conflict as a personal vendetta driven by his reunion with Jasmine. The development consortium demanded its contractual penalty, lenders requested emergency meetings, and 3 major investors threatened legal action if the Harlem project did not resume. Ethan understood why leaders hid mistakes until they became catastrophes. Transparency did not produce immediate justice, but panic, blame, and consequences distributed among people who had never seen the original decision. Avoiding those consequences had once been his excuse for trusting Michael, and he refused to repeat the same logic now. He addressed employees through a live company broadcast, rejecting polished language prepared by communications advisors. Ethan explained that Brooks Capital had submitted inaccurate redevelopment information, concealed community objections, and entered agreements that conflicted with the principles publicly claimed by the company. He accepted responsibility for creating an approval system that allowed authority to move without accountability, even though he had not directed the misconduct personally. He warned that correcting the situation would cost money, delay projects, and require difficult decisions, but promised there would be no mass layoffs used to protect executive compensation or shareholder distributions. Ethan announced that he would forfeit his salary, suspend dividends tied to his controlling shares, and place a significant portion of his equity into a reserve protecting employee wages while the company restructured its obligations. For the first time in years, he spoke without measuring how the market might reward each sentence. The stock fell another 4%, yet hundreds of employees sent messages offering assistance, documents, and ideas for rebuilding the company's investment model. Some expressed anger that leadership failures threatened their families, while others admitted they had seen warning signs but remained silent because advancement depended on compliance. Priya agreed to return as an independent advisor after Ethan guaranteed legal support and protection from retaliation. Daniel disclosed that several profitable projects could be sold without affecting core operations, providing enough liquidity to negotiate with lenders. Claire proposed converting the Harlem acquisition into a long-term community investment trust, jointly governed by residents, local businesses, and Brooks Capital, allowing returns to continue without demolition. The solution would produce less immediate profit, but it could preserve property, satisfy portions of the company's contracts, and create an ownership structure stronger than charity. Ethan brought the proposal to Jasmine, expecting her to reject any plan that kept Brooks Capital involved. She studied the structure with 3 tenant attorneys, 2 local business owners, and representatives elected by residents, before offering an answer. The neighborhood would participate only if residents held binding voting power, affordable housing protections remained permanent, and no single corporation could sell the land without community approval. Jasmine also refused the position Ethan had previously imagined giving her as lead architect, unless an open selection process found her qualified against other candidates. She would not allow personal history to create the same conflict of interest they were accusing Michael of exploiting. Ethan respected the condition, although part of him recognized how easily generosity could become another form of control when powerful people decided who deserved opportunity. The city inspector general suspended the redevelopment approval and granted 30 days for Brooks Capital to submit a corrected proposal. The consortium initially refused negotiation, but its investors became concerned that litigation would expose their knowledge of manipulated reports. Ethan offered to repay documented expenses, transfer 2 unrelated development rights, and release the consortium from public claims if it abandoned the penalty and accepted independent review. The agreement required Ethan to sell a profitable commercial property he had once considered central to the company's expansion, reducing projected earnings for several years. Board members warned that competitors would treat the retreat as weakness, while analysts predicted Ethan might never regain his former status on Wall Street. He signed anyway, understanding that a reputation built on appearing infallible had become one of the mechanisms that prevented people from challenging him. Jasmine's professional review concluded 2 weeks later, and an independent panel selected Reed Community Design to coordinate the neighborhood plan alongside 2 local architectural firms. She accepted only after every contract, fee, and evaluation score became public. Her first meeting with Ethan occurred inside the same tutoring room where they had confronted the truth, but their conversation remained strictly focused on budgets, tenant protections, construction schedules, and small business continuity. The distance between them was not cold. It was careful, shaped by 2 adults who understood that shared history did not automatically create a shared future. Ethan admired her more for refusing emotional shortcuts, although he also felt the quiet grief of realizing redemption in business did not guarantee reconciliation in love. One evening after a 12-hour planning session, Jasmine found Ethan alone in the community center gymnasium folding chairs for an upcoming resident meeting. Years earlier, she had folded chairs in the same room after he failed to appear, and both recognized the symmetry without mentioning it immediately. Ethan told her he had begun therapy because he no longer trusted achievement to reveal the fears driving him. He admitted that work had protected him from feeling inadequate, indebted, and terrified of becoming powerless again. But success eventually demanded more obedience than poverty ever had. Jasmine listened without rewarding his honesty with forgiveness he had not earned. "I do not need you to become the man you were at 23, she said. That man was hopeful, but he was also frightened and easy to control. I need to know who you choose to become now that you understand the cost." Ethan placed the final chair against the wall and answered that he did not know yet, but he intended to make choices that remained defensible even when no one he loved was watching. Jasmine's eyes softened, though she changed the subject before hope could outrun evidence. She handed him a copy of the revised neighborhood plan, which included affordable housing, restored historic buildings, local ownership funds, parks, and a permanent education center teaching residents how to protect property and build generational wealth. On the final page appeared the same principle they once wrote together beside the East River. Not as a slogan, but as a legally enforceable requirement. Every investment must leave the community stronger than it found it. The board approved the plan by one vote after Ethan committed additional shares and residents secured independent financing from pension funds, credit unions, and foundations. Michael resigned before the investigation concluded, surrendered disputed compensation, and later faced civil proceedings involving disclosure failures and breach of fiduciary duty. Ethan refused to portray him as a simple villain because Michael had once saved the company and mentored him with genuine conviction. But gratitude could not erase harm or prevent accountability. The neighborhood was safe, Brooks Capital survived, and construction would begin without displacement. Yet Ethan understood the most important outcome remained unresolved. Jasmine had chosen to work beside him, but she had not chosen to return to him, and no board vote, financial sacrifice, or public apology could make that decision on her behalf. 1 year later, the first completed building reopened on New Year's Eve, beneath a clear winter sky. Its restored brick walls surrounding 40 permanently affordable apartments, a neighborhood health clinic, and storefronts reserved for local businesses. No national television crews attended because Jasmine had insisted the ceremony belonged to residents rather than executives seeking redemption photographs. Children carried handmade lanterns through the courtyard, elderly tenants received keys to renovated homes, and families placed handwritten memories inside a sealed community archive near the entrance. Brooks Capital remained smaller than before the crisis, yet employee ownership had increased. Executive approval rules had changed, and every major redevelopment now required independent community review. Business schools studied the transformation, although Ethan considered the attention less meaningful than the fact that no resident had been forced from the neighborhood. He arrived without security, carrying folding tables from a rented truck, while Claire laughed at his unsuccessful attempt to protect polished shoes from slush. Daniel had become chief executive officer 6 months earlier, after Ethan stepped down voluntarily. Believing the company needed leadership separated from the mythology surrounding its founder. Ethan remained chairman of the Community Investment Division, where his responsibilities involved listening more often than announcing decisions. Some commentators described the change as punishment, while others called it strategic reinvention. But Ethan understood it as the first position he had chosen, without asking whether it increased his importance. He earned less influence and far more contact with the consequences of his work. Jasmine directed volunteers near the entrance, wearing the blue scarf over a charcoal coat, as she checked accessibility ramps, vendor permits, and emergency heating stations. Their relationship during the previous year had developed through ordinary acts rather than declarations, including difficult meetings, quiet dinners, disagreements about budgets, and occasional walks where neither attempted to repair 20 years in a single conversation. Ethan learned that Jasmine drank tea more often than coffee now, hated being praised for sacrifices she considered necessary, and sometimes awakened fearing another powerful institution would undo years of work. Jasmine learned that Ethan could admit uncertainty without collapsing, apologize without demanding comfort, and leave meetings unfinished when someone he cared about needed him. trust returned slowly enough to feel real. Near sunset, an elderly woman named Mrs. Alvarez invited them into her renovated apartment, where photographs of 3 generations covered the walls. She had lived in the building for 46 years and had initially assumed every promise from Brooks Capital concealed a future eviction. Now she showed them a bedroom prepared for her grandson, who could attend college nearby without leaving the family neighborhood. She thanked Jasmine for fighting and Ethan for finally listening, then corrected herself before either could respond. Listening should not deserve praise, she said, because powerful people were supposed to listen before making decisions that changed other lives. Ethan agreed, appreciating the correction more than gratitude. After the ceremony, Jasmine asked him to walk toward the East River, where snow moved lightly across the paths and the city reflected in dark water. They reached the place where they once celebrated his first investment, with cheap takeout and 2 paper cups of coffee, although the original bench had been replaced years earlier. Ethan carried the blue notebook, now protected inside a simple leather cover, but he did not open it immediately. He told Jasmine that Eleanor Shaw had visited the community center the previous month and met several families displaced by the Brooklyn project. Eleanor had agreed to fund legal aid work using part of her settlement, not because money erased participation, but because accountability required more than confession. Jasmine said she had spoken with Eleanor privately and believed remorse became meaningful only when it stopped asking injured people for absolution. Ethan understood the sentence applied to him as well, and he told her he no longer expected their renewed connection to restore the future they imagined at 23. That future belonged to 2 people who had not yet learned how fear, power, and silence could reshape love. Whatever existed between them now needed to be chosen by the adults they had become, without debt to memory or pressure from unfinished dreams. Jasmine looked across the river before admitting she had once believed keeping the scarf meant she was waiting for him, but eventually understood it represented the person she had been when she first learned someone could see her tenderness without mistaking it for weakness. "I kept it because that girl deserved to be remembered," she said, not because she needed her old life returned. Ethan nodded and handed her the notebook, open to the page containing her original warning letter and his younger promise about community. Beneath both, he had written a new sentence stating that love without attention became memory, while power without accountability became harm. He left the final line blank because he no longer believed he had the right to complete every story alone. Jasmine read the page, then took the pen and wrote that forgiveness did not restore lost time, but it could prevent lost time from controlling what remained. She closed the notebook and slipped her hand into his, not as a dramatic answer to 20 years of longing, but as a quiet decision about the evening before them. They returned to the community center shortly before midnight, where residents had gathered beneath paper stars made by children from recycled development plans. Music filled the restored gymnasium, local restaurants served food, and photographs along the walls documented not only completed construction, but protests, arguments, mistakes, and revisions that made progress possible. Near the entrance stood a bronze plaque listing every tenant committee, volunteer organization, local business, worker, planner, and investor involved in the project. Ethan's name appeared among hundreds rather than above them, exactly where he wanted it. As the final countdown began, Jasmine stood beside him wearing the scarf he once knitted badly during a winter when neither of them owned much beyond hope. Ethan did not think about magazine covers, market rankings, or the fortune that had once convinced him he could postpone every meaningful conversation until life became convenient. He thought about the letter he had never received, the choices he had made without asking enough questions, and the people who paid while he remained protected by distance. He also thought about the possibility that a person could face the truth without being permanently reduced to the worst thing he failed to notice. When midnight arrived, fireworks illuminated Harlem rather than disappearing behind hotel windows, and the room erupted with the sound of families welcoming another year inside a neighborhood they had nearly lost. Ethan turned toward Jasmine, but he did not promise forever, ask for marriage, or speak in the polished language that once allowed him to sound certain while remaining emotionally absent. He He simply asked whether she wanted to meet him the following morning for coffee and continue the conversation they had begun 20 years earlier. Jasmine smiled, tightened her hand around his, and said she would meet him at 10, provided he arrived before the coffee became cold. For Ethan, the answer was enough, because he had finally learned that a meaningful life was not built through one extraordinary gesture, one perfect apology, or one triumphant return. It was built by appearing when promised, listening before deciding, and choosing people repeatedly after the applause had ended. Together they stepped outside beneath the first snow of the new year, not returning to the love they once lost, but walking carefully toward a future neither of them needed to idealize in order to believe.